Well, I think we'll start. Let's do that. So let me get to the microphone in case there's anyone. Do we know if there are people online?
There are
one person. One person? All right. So welcome one person online, welcome people in the room, and I'm sure others will join. As usually happens, we're all pressed to get here by noon. I want to introduce Dr. Katrina Steele. I never know whether I write it as Catriona, but everyone talks about you as Katrina. What shall I say? Katrina. But it's written with an I-O-N-A. Here they come. Silent O. Katrina, in my experience, isn't silent at all. And Katrina is going to talk to us about the work on swallowing that her team is doing, which I am actually very, very emotionally attached to because I've come across so many people who are in such a sad state, primarily for that reason. So over to you, Katrina. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff, and good afternoon, everybody. So as you can see through the title, today we'll be talking about the modification of liquid consistency for people. The modification of liquid consistency for people who have swallowing impairment. And I'll just start. I obviously clicked the wrong button there. With some disclosures of my funding sources and some relationships with industry partners. So I'd like you all to start by taking a look at this picture and to imagine that perhaps it's a hot day and you've just come in from a long walk or maybe a run, and think about how refreshing that glass of water looks. And think about how many times a day you pick up a glass of water or per week, and how you take drinking water for granted. Or perhaps you're like me and you crave a really good cup of coffee in the morning on your way into work. And imagine for a moment how many cups of coffee you drink in a week or a year. Or perhaps also sort of like me, you look forward to a really good glass of wine on occasion as you're celebrating a family event or having just dinner at home. And so I hope just from those three brief pictures that you have just a momentary appreciation for how you might be taking the ability to drink liquids for granted. And the people that we work with swallowing impairment very often don't have the ability to drink liquids. And I'm showing here a picture of a theologian, Henry Nouwen, who spent the last part of his life here in Toronto. And he's written this wonderful book called Can You Drink the Cup, in which he makes the analogy between the act of drinking and the act of living life to its fullest. So, of course, here he is also using the symbolism of drinking in its religious context, drinking a cup of wine, but he very powerfully makes the case that when we get together with our friends, what do we often say? We say, I'd like to get together for a cup of coffee or come over for a drink. And so he argues that each of us in our lives, in order to live our lives to their fullest, has a cup that we have to drink out of. And of course, as somebody who works with people with swallowing impairment, it's a very powerful analogy, very challenging to think that people with swallowing impairment might in fact be denied this opportunity to participate fully in their lives through the limitation of being unable to drink liquids. Here I'm going to show you two example x-rays of people swallowing. This one here on the left will loop 5 times, and this is a perfectly healthy young graduate student swallowing a mouthful of liquid barium, which is the black that you see flowing very smoothly and quickly down through the throat. And at the end of that sequence, you see nothing at all left behind. Our bodies are designed with this quite remarkable shared pathway in the throat that serves to transport air out of the body and into the body for breathing. It also is the conduit for sending air out through the larynx to produce speech sounds. And of course, it's the conduit for transporting food and liquid into the body for swallowing. And we have two pipes at the bottom, one leading to the lungs and one leading to the esophagus and the stomach. And what our bodies have to do is reconfigure from a respiratory air transport pathway to a swallowing pathway. And so I'd like you to watch this contrasting video. Here we have a 51-year-old gentleman who unfortunately had a car accident. That's all that happened, was he had a car accident with a whiplash injury. And the whiplash injury damaged the blood vessels in the back of his neck, leading up to important control centers in his brainstem, and in particular damaged his ability to swallow. And so you can see, I hope that here at the bottom of his throat, the gate to his esophagus doesn't open, and therefore the food collects, the liquid collects, and in his case it also then flows down the wrong path towards his airway. He tries to cough, but he's unsuccessful in ejecting this material back out. And so within the span of 24 hours, he went from being a perfectly healthy, normal 51-year-old gentleman to the next 10 years of his life where he has not been able to eat or drink normally and has a feeding tube to sustain him, and lives at constant risk of respiratory consequences from material going down into his lungs. Oops, and I will just move this forward. So dysphagia then, or swallowing impairment, is a major syndrome. It's not a single medical disease. It can occur at any time in life, from the tiniest premature babies in neonatal ICUs right up to seniors. And we typically think of it being characterized by at least one of three possible features. The first thing is the person may be aware that they're having difficulty swallowing, and they may tell you, I have difficulty swallowing. This is the one component that is not mandatory. So some people are not aware that they have difficulty swallowing, and we're very concerned about what we call silent aspiration, where material goes into the respiratory system and there is no cough and no outward sign. But the major functional concern of swallowing safety involves inability to protect the airway during swallowing, so that we see the case we saw in that gentleman with material going down in towards the lungs. And then the second major functional concern of impaired efficiency, by which we mean that you take a mouthful and after you've swallowed once or perhaps twice, you've been unable to clear the entire bolus of material through your throat into the esophagus. So this may mean that you are very slow to eat, so you may need to swallow many times for that mouthful, or you may have residues that catch in the pockets of the throat and are very difficult to move. So how common is dysphagia? Well, we don't have a large reputable prevalence study, and partly because this condition occurs in many other disease and injury conditions. But estimates in the United States are that about 7% of new hospital admissions annually are affected by dysphagia, with a cost in the order of $500 billion. And if we extrapolate those numbers to Canadian figures, then we're looking at somewhere in the order of 200,000 new cases annually. And many of those cases may enjoy some degree of recovery, but some will go on to have long-standing chronic problems with swallowing. So why do we care about this? Well, one of the most prominent concerns that is explored clinically is the risk of respiratory difficulties arising from aspiration of material into the airway. And here you see what looks like a beautiful Canadian winter scene on the right-hand side of your slide. This is an X-ray of a gentleman who was having a swallowing examination, drinking a very large cup of barium, and essentially most of that cup of barium found its way into his left lung. And as the story goes with this particular case study, this was sufficient to block air exchange in his lungs. He went into respiratory arrest and died as a consequence of aspirating a very large volume of barium. We're also, of course, concerned with foods, that they can, on occasion, obstruct the airway. And so death secondary to pneumonia or airway obstruction is a possibility with dysphagia. We also need to be concerned about nutritional adequacy, particularly if people have efficiency concerns. And so here both malnutrition and dehydration are concerns. And dehydration, of course, is the #1 reason for admission for an older person from an institutional care setting to acute care hospital. And in addition to these medical type concerns, of course, there are huge quality of life consequences for having swallowing impairment. And as you can imagine, it's very difficult to be unable to participate in drinking and eating with your family or friends in a normal way. Not only does the person with dysphagia experience these challenges, but the people who are caring for them do as well. And I've spoken to many spouses who talk about the burden of having to prepare special food for their loved ones and the guilt that they themselves experience when they sit down to a normal meal in front of the family member who is unable to enjoy that. So here at TRIUHN, we have the Swallowing Rehabilitation Research Lab, and we're part of the swallowing science team with our collaborators. And we have 3 major thrusts for our research in this area. The first is about characterizing and understanding what swallowing is supposed to look like in a healthy context. And so here we do a number of different studies measuring aspects of swallowing function. We've looked carefully at tongue movement and tongue strength in swallowing. We've looked at how structures move and what the timing relationships are in swallowing of things like airway closure, for example. We've looked a little bit at sensory function. And one of the big questions that remains needing to be asked in swallowing is what changes do we expect in healthy people as they age, as opposed to changes that occur with disease and trauma. So then, of course, now that I've said that, the second major thrust of our work is to characterize those changes that occur in disease and trauma. What is it that is wrong with the mechanism of swallowing that puts somebody at risk for aspiration or for inefficiency? And so here we've worked to develop highly rigorous standardization in methods of X-ray evaluation of swallowing. And in our lab, we have developed a reputation for very rigorous analysis of those X-rays to find out exactly what the profiles of impairment are. And this is work that's ongoing, and over the next few years, we're going to be doing a standardized exploration of the pathophysiology of dysphagia in 5 disorder groups, with stroke, acquired brain injury, cervical spine injury, and then head and neck cancer, and neurodegenerative disease. But of course, all of this really is aimed at developing solutions for this problem. And so here we have 3 sub-themes under this arm of our research. We are currently involved in a very large study looking at the development of a new assessment device that is non-invasive to detect dysphagia and aspiration at the bedside. And we'll hope in a year or 2 to be able to share more about that with you. We have been for several years conducting randomized trials of different treatment protocols, and right now our focus is on tongue exercise. really taking your tongue to the gym, a boot camp type methodology for building strength and perhaps other exercise targets in the tongue. We know that older people experience tongue weakness as a natural part of aging, and also that people with dysphagia display tongue weakness. But the part of our research that I want to spend the rest of today talking about is in the area of texture modification, which is a major intervention for dysphagia used clinically. In fact, it's really the most common form of intervention, and one of the first things that clinicians look at is choosing consistencies that are appropriate for patients that will help to keep them safe and efficient when swallowing. And so what we do here typically is work with thickening liquids and also then modifying foods to be a more liquefied form. So we're going in both directions. So as you can imagine, figuring out the right consistency for a patient is one challenge, but then communicating that the characteristics of that desirable consistency is another challenge. And so I'd like you to look at these pictures. Some of you who are clinicians will already have names in your head for these 4 different degrees of liquid thickness. And others of you who may not be clinicians may have other names. And so I'm going to talk about the terminology that people use and how we can move towards better communication around the recommendation of liquid consistency. In 2002 in North America, there was a document published by the American Dietetic Association called the National Dysphagia Diet. And you can see here that they recommended the use of 4 labels to categorize or classify levels of liquid thickness. And so some of you may have had these names in your mind with that picture before, but others of you might not have thought of using the word nectar-like or honey-like or spoon-thick, which often is also called pudding-thick. And in that document, in addition to names, they began to tackle the measurement challenge. If we're going to have labels for these products, we also need to provide definitions and measurement guidelines so that they can be properly implemented. And you can see here some numbers. These are measures of viscosity in millipascal seconds, and you can see that there's a further qualification that the measurement is taken at 50 reciprocal seconds. These are very technical measurement guidelines, but in fact, these ranges were just a starting point. They were an educated guess, and that's acknowledged in the document. And there is no empirical evidence behind these ranges to suggest that as we cross from 50 to 51, for example, that we reach some sort of accepted therapeutic benefit for people with dysphagia. We don't really know whether the ranges that are recommended here are the right size either in terms of how big they are. And we struggle clinically in the field with the use of terminology and the potential for misunderstanding. So these 4 pictures that I showed you a minute ago were actually used in a study in Australia where clinicians were asked, what would you call these liquids? And I should say that at the time this study was done, Australia actually had standard terminology recommended for these liquids, but the clinicians who responded in the survey didn't actually stick to the standard recommended terminology, and they came up with 39 different descriptors for these pictures. And when it came to the food side of the equation, they had 95 different labels. And you can, I hope, imagine immediately that this could have some fairly significant consequences for patient safety. And here's an example, perhaps to challenge you in your thinking. Here we have 3 pictures of oatmeal, and oatmeal is commonly included on hospital pureed diets. It might also be very reasonable for a family member to ask, can my loved one have oatmeal on the diet that you're recommending? But of course, the answer isn't as straightforward as yes or no. It depends on what that person's mental construct of the ideal oatmeal is. And in my family, there would be two different opinions about the ideal construct of oatmeal. I would be more on the left, and my husband would definitely be in the middle. Don't think he would go quite as far as sliceable oatmeal that we have here on the far right. And here's another example. I want you to imagine that you receive this plate, and the question is the word minced appropriate to describe the characteristics of these carrots? And I think it's actually, with just a picture, hard for you to know. And obviously a very important added piece of information is how big are those little cubes of carrots. And if I told you that they were in fact the size of a pinky fingernail, for example, that might make a difference in whether or not you feel that would qualify for the word minced or not. And these are real sorts of clinical discussions that go on regularly in kitchens and at bedsides in terms of trying to decide what should or shouldn't be allowed for people with swallowing impairment. And miscommunication, or different opinions and understandings of these terminology, unfortunately, can have very serious consequences. For some reason, here in North America, we don't treat the specification of diet texture as something that is as important as the specification of the dose of a medication. But really, we should think about that. Because we don't say to somebody, you need a blood thinner, now go out and figure out how much you need. We say you need this dose. And really, there's a similar potential for injury and safety consequences if we're not very precise about the characteristics of food and liquid recommendations. And there are many stories in the literature, unfortunately, of coroners' cases where misunderstandings around food texture terminology have been found to contribute to the death of a patient. And here we have a story from Australia where a gentleman was on a vitamized diet. Now, here in Canada, I don't think most of us would know what that word means, but in Australia, that's the word they use for a pureed diet. As he moved from one hospital to another in the system with this label, vitamized diet, he reached a point where his wife brought in a very soft pasta for him. The nurse noticed that he seemed to be tolerating this very soft pasta. And after a discussion with the swallowing clinician, changed the diet entry in the computer system to read soft. And in this case, this patient was found choking on a sandwich, which was something that was allowed under the heading of soft in that facility, and unfortunately choked to death. So I like to think of this challenge of figuring out exactly what the right consistency is and how to describe it as the Goldilocks challenge or the Goldilocks dilemma. And here, as clinicians, we have to work out what the right consistency is for our patients. We don't want something that's too thin or too thick. We want something just right. And unfortunately, just right, of course, would come with some sort of measurement definition. But technical measurement of viscosity is quite simply not accessible to people in healthcare institutions, and even not commonly available in the industry sector that works with this market. So most of the providers of thickened liquids for people with dysphagia do not have access to viscometers. These are found in engineering labs at universities and in some big industrial settings. And they cost in the hundreds of thousands of dollars and are very technically difficult to learn to use properly. So it's just not practical to suggest that people would be able to measure viscosity and know whether it's between 1 and 50 millipascal seconds or 51 to 350. And so we're left with perceptual judgment of the flow of the liquids that we're presenting to people, and our own eyes and interpretations. And this study was done in Australia in 2000, where my colleague Julie Chicaro went into 10 hospitals in the Brisbane area, took samples of the thickened liquids that were provided and did do those technical measurements, and found huge variation across facilities and even within facilities in the actual viscosities of things that had the same name. So we believe it's very important to pursue standardization in the use of terminology here, A, for the purposes of safety and reducing opportunities for miscommunication. We think there's also an opportunity to improve clinical efficiency. Right now there's a lot of reassessment that happens simply because the patient is moving from one institution to another, and you can't be certain that what's called a nectar-thick liquid in hospital A would be a nectar-thick liquid in hospital B. It's also a real problem in terms of research. If we look at the research literature here, we can't compare across studies because those measurements haven't been available to characterize the products that have been evaluated. And just imagine if you're actually in the industry and manufacturing these products for different markets. Here in Canada at the moment we use nectar, honey, and pudding thick, but in Australia they have entirely different terminology, and these sectors of the market end up making different labels for every different market that they're in. So these were the ideas that led to the foundation of the International Dysphagia Diet Standardization Initiative, which I've been fortunate to be a part of for the last 3 years. And you can see our committee here. This is a remarkably collaborative interprofessional committee. And we have, as you can see, people from all around the world, but we also have here all sorts of disciplines represented. We have engineers, we have food scientists, we have a gastroenterologist, dietitians and nutrition researchers, several speech-language pathologists, and a food and occupational therapist, and a food service expert on the committee. And so we've been working for the past 3 years to try to overcome some of these challenges. And so I should just mention that IDSI is a not-for-profit organization that does rely on and is grateful for both financial and other kinds of support from a large variety of supporters and sponsors. So what did we set out to do? We decided that we needed to fix on a number of levels of modification that would be used in the dysphagia system, both for food texture and for fluid thickness. We wanted these levels to have international utility and to therefore work across different cultural settings. We also wanted them to work regardless of the age of the patient group that we were looking at, so from tiny babies right up to seniors. And it was very important that what we would come up with would be grounded in lots of stakeholder input. So we've been doing quite a number of surveys with the groups that you see listed on the slide. In addition to deciding on the number of levels that we needed, we wanted to come up with standard labels in English for these levels and ultimately to translate those labels. But a label isn't enough, so we also wanted clear descriptors for each level, and we wanted a practical, accessible measurement guideline that was valid for each level that could then be used in people's homes or in hospital kitchens to confirm what the appropriate level or label is for a particular item. And so we embarked on a 4-stage project. We are now at the end of this first generation of the project, and I'll share with you some of our findings and decisions. So early on, we thought it was important to ask people what they were doing, how many levels did they feel were necessary, and so we did a very large survey, and here you can see the responses from the health professional and food service respondents, and they told us that we needed 3 to 4 levels of liquid thickness for clinical use. They also told us that there were a large variety of different approaches to labeling these levels already in use around the world. The most common names for the different levels are shown here. You can see that some of them may be more transparent or easily interpreted than others. You can see some reference to existing products that may give you a mental picture of the consistency that you're trying to achieve. For example, nectar and honey. But in the United Kingdom, for example, they use the word syrup and custard. Now, custard means something to me, having grown up in an English family, but it may not mean exactly the same thing to me that it does to other people. You can also see there are some names here that are completely arbitrary, such as grade 1, 2, 3. Is the directionality of the system the same across different regions? No, not necessarily. When it came to foods, we also learned that people were looking for between 4 and 5 different levels of food texture, and again, a variety of approaches to labeling. And here you can see the most common terminology used to label different types of food texture. I just heard this morning actually of an example of a patient who was put on a mechanical soft diet, or that was the recommendation. Now, mechanical soft would mean something to the speech-language pathologist here in the room and perhaps to some others. But as this story went, it was interpreted by the nurse to mean pureed. So there's a really good example of potential misunderstanding and misinterpretation. And I should say that no matter how much we obsess about the accuracy and appropriateness of terminology, ultimately when these diets are ordered in hospital settings, they're translated into a set of abbreviations in a computer system. And it's actually quite fun to pull up these abbreviations and see if you can make any sense of them, and whether or not your guesses are right for what the different short forms mean. So in addition to asking clinicians and users what they were doing and what they were looking for, we went to the literature and did a systematic review to learn what does the evidence suggest to us happens to swallowing and oral processing behaviors as food and liquid consistency change, either in healthy people or in people with dysphagia. You can see a very large list of authors here, and that's because this project turned out to be much bigger than we thought. And so we started actually with more than 10,000 articles to review, and ultimately did full text review of 488. And so we had the help of a very large group of trainees around the world who helped us accomplish that task. And what did we learn out of that review? Well, we were actually pleased to find converging evidence from several studies showing that for people who do aspirate thin liquids like water, that thickening does appear to be a beneficial intervention for reducing aspiration. However, we also found converging evidence from more than one study telling us that you can thicken too much. And I think that's a finding that is important, particularly for swallowing clinicians to hear. We've always operated under the assumption that thickening is a good thing, but it turns out there's an upper limit, and as you thicken too much, you have a trade-off where the swallowing becomes less efficient and material gets left behind in the pockets of the throat. We found almost nothing about differences in swallowing or oral processing behavior across different consistencies of food. It appears that the purpose of chewing in the mouth is to convert food to a similar swallowable consistency, whatever that might be. And that's about as much as the literature provides in terms of guidance. We could not find a single point on the viscosity continuum where research agrees that one crossed from one category to another, or from unsafe to safe liquids in people with dysphagia. So exactly how thick to make these liquids remains a really important research question. And so in January of this year, we came together as a committee to put all of this information together and to try to accomplish our goal of deciding on the levels and what we were going to call them, and most importantly, how we were going to develop a measurement tool for people using these products. This is the framework that we ultimately agreed on, and after another round of stakeholder survey input, you can see here two pyramids at their broadest edges. They are unrestricted, normal food or drink, and as you then move in towards the narrower center, we have tighter and tighter degrees of restriction in terms of texture. An important paradigm shift for us was to agree that as we approach that middle zone, drinks and foods actually overlap, so that we have a level of thickened liquid that is exactly the same in its characteristics as a level of liquidized food. And you can see that that's true for two levels here. And we also wrestled with foods that didn't fit easily into this structure because of a few characteristics. One being that they change their consistency very easily in the mouth. So we were thinking of things here like ice cream melting, or things like potato chips or cheesies that fracture and then dissolve very quickly in the mouth. These are commonly used as early foods in the return to eating for people with dysphagia, but they don't easily fit into a single level. But really, I think one of the things we're most excited about after 3 years of working on this project is that we did, in fact, come to decisions about measurement that we believe are practical and accessible for end users. And we decided ultimately that viscosity measured with a viscometer just simply was too complicated to use as the measurement tool. And what we came up with was a gravity flow test using a simple 10 milliliter syringe. And these are universally the same around the world, and it doesn't matter if the tip of the syringe is centered or off to one side. And the test that we've developed and now done some validation on involves filling the syringe with 10 milliliters of fluid, allowing it to flow out the bottom for 10 seconds, and then stopping the flow. And the level of liquid consistency is defined by how much it remains in the syringe after 10 seconds. So here I will show you water flowing through a syringe. You'll see the fluid level come all the way down to the bottom at the end of the video. And this would be the prototypical definition of a thin liquid stopped. And here we have some infant formula, which would fall into our slightly thick level. And this is going to get down between 2 and 4 milliliters of fluid after 10 seconds of flow. And the mildly thick level, which is what we clinically have called nectar in North America historically, flows less fast and will be between 4 and 8 milliliters of fluid at the end of 10 seconds. And so we're very pleased with this test, and there's been actually a lot of very early clinical uptake of this test. A lot of people are running back to their kitchens and measuring the various drinks that they have available. Characterizing the properties of food turned out to be more challenging than liquids. There are two things to consider here, and the first is the particle size. And if you look to the scientific and medical literature about how large people's airways are, what we actually want here is a particle that is not large enough to block the airway. And endotracheal tubes for adults are typically 4 millimeters in diameter, and so that appears as a pretty good reference guideline for the maximum size of these particles. And fortunately for us, we went to IKEA and various other places and measured forks and discovered that the standard dinner fork has a 4 millimeter slot or gap between the prongs. And so finding a standard fork provides a very easy reference tool for working out particle size. But we also want to know what happens to these foods when they're compressed, as in chewing, or if the tongue was pressing food and moving it around the mouth. And here, the British guidelines historically have described a test where you press the food with a fork, and that food might fracture, or it might allow the fork to go into the bolus of food. And then there are behaviors when you remove the fork that are of interest. Does the fork leave a pattern in the surface of the food, or does that pattern then disappear as the food coalesces back into its original consistency? And so we liked the idea of using a fork to make these assessments, but we also wanted to ensure a similar degree of force or pressure being used across users. We struggled with this for some time and then discovered some literature that told us that applying enough force with the thumb until the thumbnail blanches might be a useful guideline in terms of the amount of force to apply. It turns out that in our experiments this translates to about 15 to 18 kilopascals of pressure, and that just happens, fortunately again for us, to align with the amount of pressure that the tongue usually uses in swallowing. So we've settled on this for now, although we would dearly love to have a test that is also more accessible to our Asian colleagues who don't typically have standard dinner forks available for this sort of thing. So in addition to the measurement guidelines and labels, we've come up with descriptors for each consistency in the framework that are available online, and frequently asked questions to help clinicians navigate this new framework. And we're now moving into a very exciting phase of implementation of the framework, which we really do hope will be adopted internationally over the next 3 years. So we're at that final consolidation and dissemination stage for the first plan of IDSI. We currently are running a pilot implementation project at a hospital in Germany that didn't have dysphagia diets historically, and is now adopting the IDSI framework as its way of setting up these diets in their system. And we're excited that a number of early adopters have come forward around the world. Here at UHM, there's some early adoption taking place in the form of projects with looking at the standardization of thickened liquids that are made in the kitchen. Right now, looking particularly at nutritional supplements and how can we make them available in different consistencies. And over the next 3 years, we know that we have a lot of work to do in terms of translating these guidelines. We are hoping to build an online archive of examples of foods with video support of measurement for end users to be able to reference. So that's the next steps for IDSI, and in terms of how our lab and team will be involved, we're very excited to report.
This is going to be a big focus of ours over the next 5 years, and we have just received funding from the National Institutes of Health to take the IDSI framework and to measure the flow of liquids in both healthy and disordered swallowing using the IDSI levels. So with that, I will stop, and I'd like to acknowledge the members of my team who you see with our Thick and Liquid Challenge here on the slide. If you're here physically in the audience, we'd love you to stop at our table on the way out and try a Nectar Thick Liquid. We have lemonade for you here, and pick up an IDSI pen, and I think we have some time for questions.
Let me ask a first question. Different cultures have different foods, and I've recently been very aware that kanji, I think moist rice, overcooked with lots of water, is helpful, and some different cultures the food is more difficult and to mince. Do you have any comments about that?
I think everybody could hear the question, so my comment would be exactly that kanji would be one example of a product that for some people might fit within their construct of pureed, but for other people it might not. It may also, depending on the particular day and batch that's been prepared, it might actually fall under a category of mixed consistencies with a solid component and a fluid liquid component, which for people with dysphagia is even more challenging. And so what the guidelines allow us to do, and the measurement instructions allow tests to be done on every batch, if you will. That's why the syringe is so beautiful for us, that we could give a wife a syringe to take home and say, when you're making your kanji, before you serve it, run it through the syringe and make sure that it adheres to these guidelines. And if there's a lump that gets stuck, then maybe you need to use a strainer before you serve the kanji. So it allows application of these guidelines at a very practical level.
Yeah, questions, Elizabeth?
Thank you, Katrina. That was very interesting and very clear. So, because I don't know very much about swallowing, actually. So you know the article you showed us that was published in
JSLHR,
where there were so many different, 95 different terms and so on used
Oh,
by
the Australian
one used by clinicians. So who were the clinicians? Like
Clinicians,
what disciplines
yeah.
were included?
That study was speech language pathologists or dietitians.
Okay.
But of course, those are for those who didn't hear the question, I think Elizabeth was asking which professions were involved in the Australian survey of terminology. Those are the most obvious professions to go to, but not necessarily the only relevant ones. And I think that food service professionals are a huge audience here that we hope to reach, and also family members who are preparing diets at home for patients with dysphagia.
Thank you.
You mentioned a boot camp for swallowing. Do you recommend that regular people should be doing these exercises, or is it only for people at risk?
Do we recommend that regular people should be doing swallowing boot camp exercises? No, I don't think I do recommend that. I think currently our thoughts about best practice in swallowing intervention are to tailor the specific exercises to the area of challenge that a patient is demonstrating. And so you really would need a personal coach in your boot camp to tell you which exercises to focus on and how hard to do them. And we don't currently see evidence that snowbirds in Florida need to go to tongue exercise classes 3 times a week. That there is some suggestion that there are age-related losses in muscle function that could be offset with some preventive exercise, and Ashwini, who's here, maybe heading into some research in that direction with people in long-term care facilities. But I think it's an area to be cautious moving forward. Certainly, we don't yet see that it's ready for broad scale up.
You know, sometimes when you're watching someone eat with difficulty, and they've got perhaps a little dementia, sometimes you wonder whether you should be encouraging them to swallow or even coaxing them to swallow, because they appear to sort of forget to do it. Their mouth is full and they... What do you
So
do?
what's my reaction to that?
Yeah.
I absolutely think that if you can focus them on the task and remove distractions and remind them that they have a mouthful of food that they need to swallow, that would be a good cue. You know, the things we were supposed to learn in kindergarten about not talking with our mouths full, those kinds of things are highly relevant in people with dysphagia.
Questions? Oh dear. I was thinking someone over there would have a question.
Same amount of walking for you. Katrina, in terms of your international ITSE group and the new terms that you've come out with, so they're in English, and you did mention translation, but are there other comparable terms in other languages, or does that remain work to be done as well?
We have an initial translation of just the labels, not the full descriptors, into 12 languages. And I think those are going to need to be carefully revised and refined and tested with user groups.
Even in English, no?
Even in English, well, no, I think we've done that. I was just in Brazil and was entertained to encounter people who said, well, that would be fine in northern Brazil, but here in central Brazil, we wouldn't use that word. And I think that the beauty of having measurement in this framework is that we could call these things, you know, January, February, March, April, if we wanted to. It's entirely arbitrary because there's a yardstick. And so we hope that people will adopt the terminology, but what's more important is that they are measuring and defining whatever they call it with the measurement tool.
Okay, thanks.
Question.
Thank you. There. Go. Make him work.
Absolutely. This will give you enough time to think of another question.
So you're talking about standardizing the viscosity measurements through a syringe, and I was wondering how sensitive those are to temperature.
That's a great question. So viscosity varies with temperature. So again, this gives you a point of use measurement opportunity. So if something was served chilled and has warmed up, then it's possible the consistency will have changed, or vice versa, if it was served very hot and has consolidated at room temperature, it may be a different consistency.
Are there professional associations of people who prepare foods that you're able to get to adopt standards?
There are. There's the Canadian Food Service Executives, or something along those lines, association. And we have a sort of liaison to that group. We're also working internationally with a group called the Food Oral Processing Association, I suppose, that has a conference. There are, of course, there's a lot of research about food texture for the healthy market, and a lot of work going on today about what happens when you change, for example, the sugar or the salt or the fat content. Does it still feel the same in your mouth? Does it still respond the same way to oral processing behavior? And so here we're sort of on the edge of the clinical side of that, and also needing to tap into that expertise.
I take a particular interest in yogurt, from natural to Greek yogurt lately, and some of the Greek yogurts got very, very thick. Anyway,
Different.
I think it's 1 o'clock. We'd better stop. Thank you for a really fascinating presentation. Very practical, very useful.
And don't forget to have some thickened lemonade.
And thanks everyone for coming.